from wherever you sit. Welcome to this webinar, this Global Immersion webinar titled How to Have Hard Conversations with a Focus on Race, Politics, and Theology. We decided 3 light topics because, we got to ease in somewhere. My name is John Huckins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion, and we're a peacemaking training organization. And our work is to help build a theology and practice for peace. We work primarily with individuals and churches and Christian universities. And our hope is to see a movement of everyday peacemakers who are actually contributing to God's bigger vision of restoration in our world. And our understanding is that conflict is not a problem to fix. It's actually an opportunity for transformation. We just need tools to engage it well. And so I'll share a little bit more about within that vision, why this webinar matters and where this conversation's going to go. Before I do that, a few logistical pieces we would love for you to jump into as you tune in. One, our panelists are again going to be talking specifically about how to have hard conversations around these topics of race, politics, and theology. And there's an opportunity to ask them questions along the way. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That's the function you want to use to ask questions as we go. I'll say up front, there has never been to date the opportunity to answer every one of these questions. Please don't see it as us trying to avoid them. We'll do our best to get to them as we can. Sometimes the panelists will be able to answer your questions directly into that thread. Other times we'll be able to actually bring them up into conversation if we have time towards the end of the webinar for open Q&A. But please be proactive in asking questions, not just now, but throughout as they pop, as they come up. The other thing is there's a chat window where we can all see each other communicate. And so even now, is if you jump in and say where you're tuning in from and why you joined this webinar, it would be really helpful for all of us to get an understanding of each of our perspectives as we sit around this table and have some conversation about hard conversations. Lastly, this is going to be a streaming conversation that we want to have played out through social media as well. One way that we found the work of peacemaking to be made tangible is to invite people into conversations we normally don't have via social media, and doing it in the right kinds of ways can actually contribute to constructive conversation and growth. And so I'm going to toss up a screen here that shows all of our social media handles for Aaron and Kristen and Jonathan and myself. The hashtag that we will use for this webinar is TGIP webinar. So grab those or take a screenshot or whatever you might need to do to have those played out as you listen to this conversation unfold and share highlights and learnings along the way. All right, let's jump in. So why this webinar and what should we expect? As I said a minute ago, we actually believe that moving through conflict leads to deepened relationships. Our experience has been that whether it's an interpersonal relationship or on the streets of our neighborhood or even on a larger global scale, when we move through conflict with tools to heal, we can grow and strengthen and deepen relationships. If you think of relationships in your own life that you have had to navigate some hardship and you've made it through to the other end, those are probably some of the closest relationships to you in your life. And real quick before I go on, can people see me right now? I'm not seeing myself. Yes? Okay, good. I'm seeing nodding heads from some of our crew, so we're good there. We define peace as the holistic repair of relationship. Holistic repair of relationship. So if God is about making things whole as the way they were initially created in the early Genesis poems, what's the journey we need to take to participate in this holistic repair of relationship? Again, interpersonally, on a systemic level, or on a global level. And when we move towards conflict, understanding that it's not the problem is actually our inability to move towards conflict well. And because we don't have tools to move towards conflict well, we often ignore hard conversations. And when we ignore hard conversations, broken stuff doesn't get fixed. And we know that our invitation is to actually be people who help broken stuff get fixed, to mend the divides of our conflicted world. And the other alternative is, if we don't have hard conversations because we don't have tools to engage them well, we sometimes will go into hard conversations, but we'll engage them very poorly. It just widens the divide, continues to deepen fractures, and we can't sit around the table and actually contribute to our collective healing. So then why are hard conversations hard? When we default into this fight or flight mechanism, most of us have not been trained or taught to engage conflict well with tools to heal and to transform, rather than to go into an argument to win or to destroy. And so we fall into this fight or flight binary, and it's a plague that I would argue is completely incapacitating not only the church, but our larger state of discourse in our country right now. This is one of the most polarized moments in the history of our country, certainly in my life. And so we have this plague of binary thinking where it's either us, them, left, right, Republican, Democrat, this side of theological aisle or this side. And it's not leaving any room for understanding. Oftentimes we'll have our agenda, our bullet points of our arguments. And as soon as we begin to name those, we fall into the binary and people dig in their heels and the entrenchment continues. And so not only do we see the other as the opponent or the enemy that we need to convince or to win against or to beat, we don't have space to disagree. We don't view disagreement as an option that allows us to we can actually disagree with people and stay in relationship. In fact, some of the most deep and constructive relationships I'm in are the ones where we've actually named our disagreements and said we can actually grow together in the midst of them. What if we actually chose to learn from one another in the midst of them? And so in this uniquely polarized moment we find ourselves in, three of the most challenging conversations that are circling around our dinner tables, in our churches, on our smartphone news feeds, are around race and politics and theology. And certainly there are plenty more, but we have to have a focus. And so these are the three we're going to focus on specifically for this webinar. And I'm thrilled that we have three guides for this journey. I don't know if any of them would consider themselves experts. I don't consider myself an expert on any of them. And but these are folks that are giving their lives to create spaces for these hard conversations to happen well around these topics. And they're going to share some of their insights of ways that these conversations can happen in unhelpful ways and ways that they can happen in actually very constructive and helpful ways, and give us some tools to engage them beyond. So with all that being said, let's jump in with some self-introductions. Jonathan and Aaron and Kristen. Jonathan, let's start with you. Will you share a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from into this conversation?
Thanks so much, John. So my name is Jonathan Brooks. I am a pastor of Canaan Community Church in Chicago, Illinois. Also an active community activist in the Inglewood community. My heart is to see residents of communities like Inglewood, which is on the south side of Chicago, a majority African-American community that has been pretty hardly disinvested in, is to see the people in the community recognize that everyday people make a difference through everyday peacemaking activity, not through just asking violent people to stop the activities they do. So it's my heart to see peacemaking increase in the world.
Awesome. Thanks, my friend. Kristen, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'm Kristen Howerton, and I actually have a background in marriage and family therapy. That was my job for about 10 years. So conflict resolution is something I did quite a bit. I then shifted into blogging. I write a blog called Rage Against the Minivan. And while it has primarily been a space to talk about my kids and parenting, I'm also very passionate about social justice and racial justice and politics. And so I began writing about those topics as well, and found that people were really interested to talk about those. So out of that, I started a podcast with a Republican friend who we have been debating with one another for about 10 years, and decided to just record it. So we do a weekly podcast called Why Partisan, talking about politics from different sides.
Excellent. Thanks, my friend. Aaron.
Hey, glad to be with you guys. First, John, can you put that graphic back up that you put? I just have a question. I thought I noticed something.
Oh no, I gotta find it again. Jeez. Hang on a minute.
My basic question is that your Twitter handle? Which I think is pretty spectacular. If that is a typo, that is pretty spectacular.
Oh,
Do you have it?
Wow.
Can you put it up?
Everybody, please hold. I just wanted
John Huck Sins. That is
Woo! Yes, it is John.
That is amazing.
H-U-C-K-I-N-S. You can ditch the first S.
I think there is deep insight in that typo.
Freudian slip.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. That's a good.
Yeah,
Are you done with your introduction now? Can we move on?
That's all I wanted to say. Thanks, everybody. No, my name is Aaron Nyquist, and I've been a worship leader and a liturgist for a number of years, mostly in evangelical churches. And in the last few years, have been really feeling drawn into more practice-based, kind of neo-liturgical formation kinds of things. So I've been saying I want to create practices and experiences that help form us into Christ-likeness for the sake of the world. So that's kind of what I've been up to.
Beautiful. Thanks, my friend. And to all of you jumping in, thanks for, there's a bunch of you that have already jumped in with where you live and why you're on this call, from Germany to Idaho to Minneapolis and across the board. So keep doing so. It's great to have you with us. Again, the Q&A function, if you jumped in late, is the place to go for questions directed specifically to our panelists as the conversation unfolds. We will get to them as we can throughout. All right. With all that being said, let's jump into this first conversation around race. One preface I want to say before Jonathan begins to give us some insight into this is not. We have a very short amount of time, and so we're not going to be unpacking the theology behind these topics or the philosophical nuance. We're going to be talking about tools to engage these conversations in unhelpful ways or very helpful ways. And so just to place your expectations in the right place, we can happily point you to resources that help us excavate some of this theology and philosophical and cultural nuance. In fact, in our follow-up email, which will be coming after this webinar, we're going to have a list of resources and tools, and we're happy to include some there. So if that's something you need, feel free to jump in the comment thread and chime in on that. Otherwise, with that being said, Jonathan Brooks, why don't you kick us off on why this conversation is so important around race?
Thanks, John, again. I love the fact that as we talk about hard conversations, we talk with one of the most polarizing things that's happening in our nation now, and that's race. And when we talk about why race is such a polarizing topic, whether we're talking about in our homes, or our churches, or just society as a whole, I think the truth is that race is one of those exposing mechanisms. It exposes the sins of our country, exposes the sins of our churches, exposes the sin in our homes, exposes the sin of white supremacy and how it's like the central part it's played in the very creation of American society. So, when we talk about tools necessary, right, like discussing race becomes important because it's what actually leads us to uncomfortability. Because race is really talking about this notion of what people or how people have been made comfortable in the country, and talking about race automatically moves us towards uncomfortability. And I think that's the key and why it's so polarizing, because it completely kind of topples the apple cart and makes us uncomfortable. We have to grapple with the collective sin of oppression, the collective accountability that we as people of color have for those who fought for our freedom in the past. And so it makes us accountable for the privileges and the disinvestment that we presently experience. So, that idea of comfort and happiness as an American ideal that rug gets snatched out from under us, because we know that only a portion of our citizens actually get to enjoy that comfort that America likes to kind of stand itself on. So I think that's why it's so polarizing. And to be honest with you, it leads us to have really unhelpful arguments and debates, especially theologically. We like to talk about, the fact that we are, there's one race, or we're all one new creation. And so everybody should just be colorblind. And, that's problematic because it actually causes us to think race at its core is about skin color, when actually race is all about power. So when racial language was actually created, it was code words for people's places in our broken hierarchy, and so it becomes important that we always affirm that skin color, culture, and context, although they are ultimate, they are important, right? And so once we affirm the differences in one another, the beauty in our skin color, the beauty in our various cultures, then we can have the hard conversation because we're starting from a consistent point and a common point. And so in these difficult conversations, it becomes immensely important that we affirm the beauty in which God has created everyone in his likeness and image, and a persona that will be completed in heaven, as we think about eschatological nature, not destroyed. I think the other thing is even people of color sometimes fall prey to that, because we want to dismiss the implications of a racial system and think that if we just live in a way that would be viewed as respectful, we'll be good. So we fall prey to respectability politics. And what I like to say, go ahead.
Yeah, on that, I think it's a really important piece that the starting point of the conversation, I think for a lot of Christians, especially dominant culture folks like myself, will have a theological framework that says we're all equal, which I think we'd all agree on. We all inherit the image of God in us, but each of our stories is unique. And so rather than being colorblind, we need to become color competent. Like, I need to understand the history and the uniqueness of your story and my contribution to it, both the beauty and the ugly, because I certainly have had some of that. So I'm just wondering if you could help us unpack a little bit more of the importance of being color competent, because I think that also brings us on this path of, like, when I look at that and I look at my friends of color, I actually need to go on a confessional journey before I even get to the table and say, okay, we're all equals. Can we just see ourselves as God's image bearers and we start at the same place? Like, I'm not sure that's a helpful starting point for that conversation.
Well, this is why understanding that racism is about power dynamics, not about necessarily skin color, is so important. Because while skin color has implications, because that's how we tied the power dynamics to this system, it's important to recognize that if you can see race as about power dynamics, then you can't enter the conversation just saying that everyone's on an even playing field because we're created in the image of God and we're all, no, you'll come in and say that our system has created uneven power dynamics in which I never had to learn your story. I never had to learn your history. I never had to learn or understand your culture. And because my culture and its dominance has become the standard, I don't start at an even playing field. And therefore, the only way we can actually become even is by moving ourselves closer to one another, in this sense of me coming down out of my dominance and you being lifted up into a place of us actually being at an even starting place. I think when we read scripture and it talks about the first will be last and last will be first, we somehow think that's the flipping of our broken hierarchy, when really what Jesus was saying is, no, we'll actually begin to lower and raise so that we can get to that place of understanding we're all created in the image of God. So.
And I wonder too, and this might just be a statement to my sisters and brothers like myself in dominant culture reality, that to start this conversation well, especially with our friends of color around race, is for us to become students ourselves, like for us to begin to excavate our contribution to the beautiful and the broken of these stories, to become competent, to not, like Jonathan, I've heard from so many of my friends of color, especially leaders, who are just becoming exhausted at helping me as a white dude try to figure out my own crap, like to teach me how to become competent. I think we need to take some responsibility on ourselves. I'm speaking again to my dominant culture friends here, that we need to enter that journey in order to enter into a hard conversation on race in a helpful way.
Man, absolutely. I mean, it is exhausting. I mean, one of the main things that I like to tell people in these conversations is that you have to give people of color the opportunity to retreat and leave the conversation for a moment, because there's often trauma being reintroduced as we try to have difficult conversations about something that has been plaguing us throughout our entire existence in the country, right? And so with that, it gives us the opportunity to not always be centering the dominant culture in our conversation, right? How everything is about how do I make you comfortable again, or everything about how do I answer your questions, rather than just coming to us and asking us. Sometimes we would appreciate you doing the research on your own and coming with your research and allowing us to engage with you in dialogue about what you have learned, read, and seen through relationship in other spaces, rather than coming to me and saying, hey, can you help me to be more blah, 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 blah. You know, it's frustrating for people of color, even though we understand why that happens and we do appreciate it. You just got to understand that it does reintroduce more trauma when you ask me to now come and be your teacher on how to not traumatize me from the majority standpoint. So that's why the conversations are so difficult. That's why. Yeah.
That's good. So what are some is we're talking about unhelpful starting points and helpful starting points to enter into this conversation that lead us to some tools. How would you interact with that?
Yeah, so I think one that I see all the time, especially on social media, that probably burns me up the most is, please do not, even if you take the stance that, and I agree that racism is a fabricated, created tool to talk about uneven power dynamics, please know that it does not dismiss the reality of the ramifications of that system on people's lives. And so there's so many times I see in the comments underneath someone expressing their disapproving of something that happened or their frustration when they go, well, I don't know why we're even talking about this because we'll never move forward. Do not dismiss people's lived experience. It is never helpful. Always affirm people's lived experience and try to understand their story better. I think that is a huge conversation to have. I think the other is to make sure that we don't try to replace racism with classism. Remember that in America, classism and racism are inextricably tied together. That is the system we've created. So yes, while being poor has extreme ramifications on the way you exist in this society, there are people who are not poor, but people of color who experience the same trauma just because of skin color. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. And dominant culture people really spend their time with either ors, definitives, and maxims. And we as people of color with more of a global understanding of the world, we recognize that both and exists all the time. So try to stick with both ands in your dialogue and don't focus on either ors all the time. So for my dominant culture folks, I just like to say, ask yourself, to what extent can you as a dominant culture person decide to be less dominant? Think about the moments when you feel less comfortable and pay attention to those moments, because those are the moments where you need to kind of stick. When the conversation gets uncomfortable, that's actually the place where you want to stay, because it's the place that pulls you out of the comfortability that comes from being a part of the dominant culture. You can never really totally distance yourself from the idea of whiteness and dominance, but you got to recognize that it's a good starting point to be uncomfortable for once and to stay there and to not get upset and frustrated and want to leave because you're uncomfortable, because that's where people of color always live. They're always uncomfortable. But I also like to say to people of color before I'm done, because people of color get frustrated, if I'm honest, with all of the conversations about race centering on how to make white people feel more comfortable and how to make the dominant culture feel like they can be okay. We have to be careful as well, thinking that our lived experience is good enough. Now, while it's irreplaceable, it's super important, it's still important for people of color to study the issues that other people of color experience in this country, especially around race. Michael Eric Dyson gave a quote in the February issue of Ebony when he said, one of the most tragic consequences of racism is making people believe they don't have to study their own culture, and that to be born whatever culture they are is to know that culture. And it's just not true. Our lived experiences are important, but our own personal lived experiences may cause us to make statements that appear out of touch or even dismiss other people of colors, the ways they deal with racism on a daily basis. So I would just say, make sure that we don't allow our lived experiences to be the only way that we interact with one another.
Such a good word. Thanks, my friend. And as you have questions that come up for Jonathan, feel free to put them again in the Q&A. And if we get time at the end, we will circle back to those in a live conversation. One last thing I'll say about this before we move to Kristen is this is, and it's, again, especially speaking to dominant culture folks, this is an opportunity for our formation. This is why race isn't another polarized topic. This is an opportunity for us to actually live a cross-shaped life. Like Jonathan's talking about, the invitation to lower ourselves from our dominant positions, to learn from, to confront the blind spots in ourselves, to understand that we can often create God in our own image. And when we begin to realize that we follow a first century Jewish rabbi who was dark skinned, living in the Roman Empire in first century Palestine, and we understand the implications of the Jesus we follow, and then do some interrogation of the Jesus we have inherited in a way it just affirms our power and our dominance and our whiteness, then this is a confessional formational journey. And when we're on that journey, we can shift our posture in how we engage these conversations, less about winning an argument and more about how are we actually contributing to some healing in ourselves and in those around us. So such a good word, Jonathan. Thank you for that. We're all anxious to have these conversations better because we know the implications are huge. Okay, let's move to politics. And Kristen, this is something that you're inviting us and guiding us into to do well. I can't imagine. I mean, I think of politics right now, and it makes my skin crawl oftentimes because it's so divisive. Like, you just drop any kind of political statement and it's just this firestorm. And I would argue that, and this is primarily church folk on this call, we've contributed to it. Like, we've placed our allegiance to the United States of America ahead of our allegiance to the kingdom of God, and it's allowed us to get into these polarizing binary fights about politics that are unhelpful, they're not constructive, and they're not even reflective of the one we follow oftentimes. So help us out with this. Guide us into hard conversations on politics.
Yeah, we are living in a really polarizing time, aren't we? And it seems like it's at a fever pitch right now. I don't really remember in my lifetime politics being quite so divisive and families being quite so divided. And I certainly think that we have in leadership a president who is kind of fanning the flames of some of that division. But I also think that there are a lot of things kind of coming together to create this perfect storm. We've got social media, which, while I'm a huge fan of social media, it's literally my livelihood. But while I think it can be a great place to share, it can also be an echo chamber. We know and have seen that Facebook is basically geared to confirmation bias. And what I mean by that is, if you are liberal, you're going to be shown more liberal ideology. If you are conservative, you're going to be shown more of that. When you join, social media, you're basically being fed information from people who think the way that you do. And so this can create even more polarization because we are beginning to believe that everyone is on the same page with us. And then when someone disagrees, we are just outraged. And I think, that's something a lot of us saw in the last election where, on Facebook, it looks like everyone agrees with me. And then the election results would, indicate that perhaps I was wrong. But I also think social media provides that sort of a buffer outside of real relationship where we can be bolder, we can call people out in a way that we never would across from a dinner table. It's that, snappy, like, I'm upset and let me just, push people down. But you mentioned it too, there is this interesting marriage between Christian evangelicals and conservative politics. And this is a marriage that has been in existence for many, many years. It's fascinating. I mean, I could spend the whole time talking about this, but I won't. But Paul and I talk about this quite a bit on our podcast, and you kind of mentioned it. For some people, nationalism or conservatism is an integral part of their faith. Their Christianity is tied and intertwined with these political ideologies. And so that's important as we enter conversations with people and family and friends to understand that, you know, for whatever reason, whether it's the way they were raised, whether it's those are the news outlets they watch, they really see all of this as being very tied. And sometimes there are little conversational surgeries that have to happen to help people maybe move out of this umbrella of Christian and conservatism being exactly the same thing, and then maybe not understanding that perhaps some of this should be separate and could be separate, which is hard. But in terms of, you know, how you have good conversations about this stuff, first, you know, I'm going to put on my marriage and family therapist hat and just talk about the basics of conflict resolution. This is not specific to politics, but these are just best practice ideas. First of all, as you know, perhaps trite as it sounds, I think it's really important to be vulnerable. I think we can lose vulnerability in political conversations. We can get pedantic with people. And I think when we speak from our own experiences, our own feelings, our own values, and we can be vulnerable, I think that it creates more ability to have conversation. So, you know, rather than me preaching and screaming about my feelings about immigration rights, if I can talk from my own personal experience, and everyone has a personal experience. My personal experience is I have an adopted son who's an immigrant, and it took us a very long time to get him, you know, status and what it's like for him living here and how it feels for me when people talk about immigrants. If I can talk vulnerably about my feelings, that's going to go a lot further than me just being angry or accusatory to other people. I also think having empathy for the person that we're talking to, actually hearing and listening to their lived experiences, you know, rather than seeing them as the other, you know, adversary, seeing them as a person, as a whole person who's come to their viewpoints through their own lived experiences. I also think it's really important to start these conversations acknowledging shared values, because while our politics might be widely different, most of us can kind of step back, even with, you know, maybe our family and friends that we disagree with the most, and acknowledge that we have a value. Say, for example, we have a value to be anti-racist. Now, how we're living that out might be flawed, but if we can step back and go, okay, you know, I want to be kind to everyone. I want to be a good citizen. I want my country to flourish. I want the people of my country to flourish. If we can step back and kind of put together shared values, then a conversation can flow from the things we agree on and then how those things get put into place versus starting at what we disagree. And then basic, you know, kindness in conversation, not interrupting, timing it well. You know, this is probably not a conversation that needs to happen at Thanksgiving at the dinner table. We can have good boundaries around these conversations. If this conversation starts at 11 p.m. while we're visiting mom, you know, maybe that conversation could be tabled. I like to use the word, the phrase, let's put a pin in it, you know, when things are going wrong and, you know, the environment is not right, like having good boundaries and saying, you know, I really want to talk to you about this, but now doesn't seem like the best time, or it seems like we're heated. Maybe we need to take a break, that kind of a thing. So those are some of the basics, I think, of just, you know, conflict resolution. But then as it pertains to politics and is more specific, again, trying to speak from personal experience, not from ideology, not, you know, recounting the talking points that we heard on our favorite news program that morning, trying not to make value judgments, you know, trying not to say, oh, well, if you believe that, then you're, you know, then you must be a misogynist or you must be xenophobic. And let me make a note on words like that too. I think it's also important to know your audience and who you're talking to. I think we can start to assume, especially maybe if you're in liberal circles, that the people we're talking to understand the same vernacular and even have the same understanding about terms we're talking about. But, you know, I mean, if you're talking to your 70-year-old mom, you might not want to, you know, harp on intersectionality. She may not know what that means. So, you might have to pull back a little, do a little more explaining, making sure that you're not using terminology that either isn't understood or is misunderstood. I think it can be helpful to try to look for external things to help start a conversation. One thing that Paul and I used to do before we started our podcast is we would, tell each other like, oh, you've got to read this book. And so, I would read a book that was coming from a more conservative perspective, and he would read a book coming from a more liberal perspective. And if we agreed, I'm really going to take the time to listen to your side, then we could come back together, and then he could say, well, I thought that was interesting, or I didn't agree with this. And then I could say, okay, well, I liked that in this book, but I'm still not buying the whole thing. With family members, sometimes that might look like, agreeing that you're each going to share a documentary with each other, or you're going to share a news program that you watch together. Sharing your perspective and being willing to look at the other person's perspective without flying into a blind rage when they talk about things you don't like. On that topic, I think it's really important to know your facts. It's really important that we don't come into these conversations based on things that we saw on Twitter, based on something that someone forwarded us in an email, that we really are informed, that we really have our facts straight, because I think that is where things go really awry is, when I was forwarded an email from my aunt, and then I believe all of that email to be true, and then I insert that into a conversation that becomes really problematic. I think it's important, to stay in these conversations and not use them as a proving ground to show how woke you are, how kind you are, how Christian you are. Coming to a conversation where you have an objective of proving yourself, whether it be your benevolence, how progressive you are, how godly you are. When you come to it wanting to show that, that's an agenda, and that's not really a conversation anymore. And then lastly, I think, being willing to be uncomfortable, being willing to push into these conversations. I think these conversations are really important because without them, we just sit in our own confirmation bias tribes. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable, especially, for people who are passionate about social justice or racial justice. If we're not having these conversations with the people that are outside of our circle, then we're just an echo chamber. If I'm just preaching on Twitter to other liberals, there's no point there. I need to be having these conversations with the people that have been put in my life, who don't agree or who don't understand. And I need to take the patience and the time to have those conversations. And I think to one of Jonathan's points, I think, it's kind of on white people to put other white people in check and to have some of these harder conversations, particularly around race with white people. That like if my family is, out in left field in the way that they're looking at race, like I need to then come in and try to do my best in having that conversation, not, for the people that are in my circle. And then last, just being willing to be wrong, being willing to be wrong in our assumptions about other people, in the things that we think, in, pushing narratives on people that, perhaps we find aren't true, being humble, being willing to be corrected, and willing to admit when we don't know everything, that we don't have all of the answers.
Oh my gosh. I'm taking lots of notes, Kristen, and I hope everyone rewatches that like 17 times. That is so unbelievably helpful. And like what I'm hearing you say, in addition to what you gave us, are like a significant series of tools to engage as well. But I'm hearing, like, there's a mentor someone who's become a mentor of mine, who says we need to stop hearing about people and start hearing from people, especially those who think differently than us. And that's what I'm hearing. Like, we have to humanize in such a way that we're not just hearing about the other side of the aisle through our favorite news channel or social media feed. We need to hear from them around a table that allows us to share those values, like to communicate shared values, hear their shared experience, and leads towards understanding. We always say as well, like, we have to lean into these hard conversations seeking to understand rather than to be understood. Mm-hmm. Because if we're going in with that agenda, as you said, it's broken from the start, and it's going to perpetuate itself throughout that conversation. So that is unbelievably helpful. Let me add one piece and just hear you interact with it for a minute. Because we happen to live in a nation state that is a democracy, and when we talk about politics, disagreement is actually a necessity for a democracy to flourish and to work, and we have a role in that. Like, even if we understand our citizenship to the United States is secondary to the kingdom of God, we have a responsibility to engage in this democracy, and that often leads to seeing disagreement, again, not as a problem, but as one of the gifts we have. So how do we get to that place where we might end up in different spaces, but we still pursue relationship and see that as actually a beautiful reflection of the system we're part of?
You know, it's hard. That's a hard one. And I'll admit that that's still a hard one even for me. And I can vacillate between, you know, looking at our differences, like you said, but then also feeling like, well, if everyone's going to believe this ideology, then the world is falling apart, you know?
Yep.
I think it's really, really challenging. It's particularly challenging when some of the ideology is leading to legislation that is hurtful and oppressive to other people. That's where it gets really hard. But again, I think when we're in those conversations, having that vulnerability that, you know, when we talk to other people, to say, you know, I hear where you're coming from, but at the same time, from my perspective, this might be hurting other people, you know, coming from it from that perspective. But it's hard. I mean, I don't know that I have that one mastered yet, because I can just as easily as anyone else want to just slam the door and block my family members on Facebook and, you know, and bail on the conversation. But I will say that one of my goals in writing, you know, I'm at the end of the day, I write a mommy blog. You know, it's not a blog about politics, and it's a blog that's widely read by Christians and evangelicals. And one of my goals has always been to talk about politics in a way that doesn't alienate the conservative and that doesn't make them go, I'm out, you know, I don't want to listen anymore. And I do that because I want to talk to people who believe differently than me. I feel like if I don't, then again, we're all in our corners. And if I can shift somebody a little bit, you know, then it's worth it. But it is uncomfortable, and it can be really enraging at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you. We could talk about this for another hour, any one of these topics for sure, but we need to move on. And on that note, let's talk about how to have hard conversations around theology. And this, again, isn't about, we're not going to do the theological excavation stuff right now, but specifically, and Aaron, your contribution is so unique and important in this, because you've walked through different circles in the faith community, in churches and evangelicalism, and you have been growing yourself in your faith, and that includes theology. So how to hold this tension and have conversations about a theology that is growing, that is active, and also be in the space where there's theological expectations and buckets that you kind of have to sign off on. That's largely what evangelical has been built around in this last century. So jump into this. Help us understand how to have hard conversations around theology.
Yeah. Well, first I just have to say, Jonathan and Kristen, that was like a freight train of goodness. So much wisdom. So it's like we've had this big feast, and now I have to try to say something helpful. But to your point, John, I was just realizing I grew up really in a fundamentalist church. And then I've spent most of the last 20 years in kind of evangelical megachurch world. And the last 2 days I just spent at a Catholic retreat center. So it's kind of like that full experience. And so what I'd love to do with these couple minutes is maybe just share one story and then two practices. And then Kristen, the story actually underscores a point you made so brilliantly. And it's basically this. I have a family member. When we talk about theological conversations, whenever we get into theological conversation, at some point, he will turn it to the end times. It never fails. No matter what we're talking about, suddenly we're talking about Armageddon and the rapture and these kinds of things. And at first it would make me really mad. Like, what are you doing? Like, we're talking about such and such. Why are you bringing it this? How do we even know this? And I would fight back and I would push and I would say, I think you just read that in Left Behind 3. Like, I don't think that's actually a thing, But what I realized is we were talking one time and I was just like, wait a second. And I said, hey, why does this matter so much to you? Like, what is it? What does this matter? And he wasn't ready for that conversation. And he said, you know what? There is so much pain and injustice in the world. And I need to believe that God's going to put it all right someday. And I just remember thinking, me too. Amen. Yes, God is redeeming and restoring all things. And for him, this was the way to keep talking about that deep hope, which to Kristen's point, that is something we share so profoundly, that God is mending the world. Now, I don't necessarily believe some of the ways that he's predicting this is going to happen. But now when we have that conversation, I still don't totally resonate, but I get him. And so that was the first practice I wanted to mention. It's the practice of getting curious, and not just curious about his point, because I think sometimes we can do that. All right, what are they saying? But getting curious about why it even matters to make that point to him. And that has been so helpful, because obviously, our beliefs are not like beliefs we came up with in a laboratory, weighing evidence and coming to an objective conclusion. Like, it's messy and complicated, and it's about our stories and our wounds and our gifts and our personalities and our relationships. And we have to get underneath the argument to understand, and then ideally empathize with the why, even if we disagree with how it's expressed. And so it feels like the first step, but the second step maybe is more difficult. We need to do this for ourselves. Like, when this person kept bringing up the rapture and these things, I would get so angry. Why? Like, I need to get curious about why that triggers me in that way. We all know some disagreements are like light and easy, and other disagreements send us through the roof. Let's get curious. Why? What is that about my story? What is that about me? Richard Rohr has observed that we don't often see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And so to just get curious and figure out, what am I contributing? Which I think brings to the second practice I wanted to mention. And it's so basic. It's like Christianity 101. But it is the practice of forgiveness. Learning to forgive those who have disappointed and hurt us. Nothing sours a human soul like festering unforgiveness. And nothing sets us free like choosing to let it go. And so I'm believing that the conversations about religion or anything that I've blown up have been so much about what's going on in me that I export into the conversation. And so very often I'll get done with a really heated conversation and I'll be walking away or driving away thinking, that wasn't about that conversation. That wasn't about that person. That was about such and such. That was about. So do we have one more minute? Can I teach one quick practice? Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I have a spiritual director. He's a Jesuit priest, and I was bringing something like this. And there was one person that was driving me crazy, and I was having all these imaginary conversations. And it was always like A Few Good Men. When I was like in the court, like, you can't handle the truth, that whole thing. And that was always me, and I was always winning in my imaginary conversations. And I was explaining this to Father Michael, and he said, have you ever thought about forgiving this person? And I said, shut up, Father Michael. I don't want to do that. But he taught me this very simple practice, and it was 4 parts. And he said, in God's presence, spend a minute telling God the things about this person that drive you crazy. And he's like, God can take it. So He said, step 2, in God's presence, spend a minute telling God all the things that you imagine drive that person crazy about you. Name it. Articulate it best you can. Step 3, spend some time praying that God would bless that person. And then step 4, spend some time asking God that God would bless you as you forgive and those kinds of things. And Father Michael was telling me that, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to do that sometime this week. Definitely, I'm going to do it, kind of pushing it off. And he goes, let's do it now. And led me into about this experience. But my whole point in saying this is, if, we live from the inside out, right? And if we carry around these resentments and these kind of bubbling, festering disappointments, it's pretty hard to have difficult conversations, because that stuff tends to come bubbling out. And especially if we're right in a conversation and we know it. Because then all that anger that I feel about this person that I will not address, I get to destroy this person because they have a stupid argument, And so to begin with what is going on inside us, so that we have, I don't know if it's a foundation to stand on as we engage these conversations in respect. So a couple thoughts.
So good. And what I'm hearing you say, Aaron, is even the whole approach to this question is not to become intellectually smarter in our theology, but to begin to try to live into the theology that we are saying yes to. I mean, even all, like you just gave us these tools, but more than anything, you gave us this posture. Like, I am going to live as a reflection of my theology rather than bullet point you into right thinking and in cerebral assent into a theology, which has largely been what we've grown accustomed to and fascinated by in evangelical circles, is like, hey, what's your statement? And check, rather than how am I actually living a theology that's reflective of the one I follow. And that informs how I engage with you who might think differently about that.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing from you is like how we enter these conversations is a direct reflection of the theology we are trying to invite people towards.
100%. Who we are, like, I want to become the kinds of person who can have a constructive conversation, not just learn ways to have a constructive conversation. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Both are really important. But for me, even if I know the right things to do, once that thing gets triggered, it's over, And so,
That's good. And a lot of the comments that are coming in, which I know we haven't gotten to most of them, are around, and it just came up as you were talking, Aaron, the theology. Like, how do we deal with the perpetual critique we feel from folks when we're sharing where we're at on our theological journey, which for us is the most faithful expression of what it means to follow Jesus, to continually tear into and grow in our theological space. But people that aren't necessarily in that space, or people that have known us or where our identity has been shaped, are now pointing fingers and saying, you're crazy, you're a heretic. Would you give a little insight into how we stay grounded in our theological journey, and then how that relates to how we're continuing to engage in those hard conversations with those that might be pointing the finger?
Oh, yeah, it's so difficult. I mean, you asked right before we started, I'm just coming from a retreat with about 70 different Christians who are all saying, I've been on this journey, and the faith journey I've been on has kind of come to an end, and I'm looking for something more and something deeper. And one of the comments we heard over and over and over was, I'm so grateful to be reminded that I'm not alone. Mm-hmm. And sometimes this can come through a book. Sometimes this can come through a chance encounter. Sometimes it can come from a retreat or something like that. But to have those moments where you realize I'm not crazy, or maybe we're all crazy, but we're crazy together. And we probably can't live in those spaces, and that wouldn't be healthy either. But we can't not have those spaces and expect to always be the lone person trying to represent something that I'm only just stumbling into. I'm not even sure. So, yeah.
That's good. Thank you, my friend. Such a helpful contribution. Those of you that are listening, these questions are really good, and we're going to create. I just pinged one back to Aaron. I'm going to toss one to Jonathan and one to Kristen. So we're going to go over the 11 o'clock hour a little bit. So just a heads up on that. But Jonathan, one that that keeps coming up, maybe you could help us with this, and maybe others here need to jump in, is how do we go into hard conversations with those we love who are being overtly racist? Like there is an injustice that, you know, we often say in our trainings, we have to stand in front of any bulldozer that's flattening people. And racism is flattening a lot of people. And there's times I just need to stand in front of the bulldozer and take it and lay down my privilege or leverage my privilege in that space. But what's that conversation look like? Or is it even a conversation?
Yeah, that one's tough. So once again, I think that often what happens when dominant culture tries to respond or react in moments is they have to go to a binary, right? It's either this person is being racist, I have to stand up against it and dismiss myself or disconnect myself, or I don't disconnect myself and I don't stand against it, and now I am affirming the racist statements that they're saying. What we as people of color understand, because we never live with that lens, is the truth is that you have to learn how to do both. You have to learn how to actually stand firm against racist statements by saying that's unacceptable. I won't allow you to say that. You are talking about my friends, people I am in relationship with. And at the same time say to them, but because you're my family or because we have a relationship, I'm willing to stay in relationship with you to help you understand why that's racist. But I will not allow you to say that in my presence, right? I will not allow you to affirm that in my presence. It doesn't have to be an either or. It's not necessarily separating myself from a relationship because of it. Now, there is a flip side to that, to where when a person continues to be racist in their comments and in their actions, right, it becomes imperative that we stand against them, even if that's an embodied way, physically protecting people, because we know the evil of racism is true. It is a sin, it is evil, and it is causing damage to people. So it's never either or, it's really case by case. You have to look at the person who you're actually in relationship with that's being overtly racist and see what your relationship can do to be able to thwart that, right? Is it that I have to just completely remove myself from that relationship because they won't listen? Or is it that my relationship is so long standing that I might have to lean in further into an uncomfortable conversation and dialogue and moment where my body is physically used to protect someone because of the overt racism? So it's never a just one size fits all answer. It is based on the relationship you have with the individual that's being racist.
That's good. Thanks, Jonathan. And I think that goes back to the importance of us, and Kristen, you really implored us on this, to stay around the table with those we do have influence with and to be in those relationships. So when those moments come up, we have enough relational equity and credibility to say hard things when they need to be said, especially when it's coming at the expense of someone who is not around that table but will be impacted by that ideology or that practice. Which kind of leads into I'm trying to take, you guys have had so many great questions, and those of you that are saying, hey, is this recorded? Can we get a transcript? Yes, it's being recorded. If you registered for this, which you did, if you're listening right now, we are going to send you the recording in the next day or two, along with resources and next steps. So take heart, and you can rewatch. You can slow down your note taking. But Kristen, I want to go back to the politics thing in the disagreement. Like, we can disagree with people. Something I'm confronting in my position as a dominant culture male specifically, like, there's political stuff that can go on and it's not going to impact me that much. Honestly, like, whoever's elected, it's going to have some impacts on tax returns and health insurance, but like my legal status or the kind of race tensions I'm exposed to, like, it's just not going to impact me near as much as my undocumented neighbor, who is like a mom to my kids. They run to her. If Jan or I are not there, they run to her. And in this moment, it would be out of my privilege that I would say, well, I can just disagree with people that say she should be shipped away, because it doesn't impact me. It impacts her. And so now I'm having to say, on a systemic level, I have to care about stuff. It's out of my privilege that I can just agree to disagree or insulate or isolate myself from political policy because this beautiful human being is going to be separated from her 4 kids and our family, and that now. So help us with that a little bit. Like, and that's, again, it's a synopsis of some of the questions that come up. Yeah, we can disagree on stuff, and we have to if we're going to make any kind of road forward toward healing and restoration. But then there's systemic issues that need to be dismantled. You're on mute, by the way.
Thank you. And I think that's, going back to this idea of starting with shared values, because I think, while, I can even think of family members that I know, while they may agree with some super racist policies, or they might agree with some really xenophobic laws around immigration, if I step back and say, no, can we just agree that we don't want to be racist? Like, do you want to be racist? I know their answer is going to be no. And I think that's true for most people. Sure, there are the people who are like, yes, I'm racist. And those people might be hard to talk to. But I think most of us are talking about people who would stand on a platform of I'm not racist, and then out of the same mouth say and do things that are very racist. So if we can start from, I don't want to be racist, I don't want to be xenophobic, again, probably not using that word, I want to be kind to other citizens. I care about the people of Syria. I care about Mexicans who live in my community. If we can start from that shared value and we go, awesome, we both agree, we're on the same page. We care about our Mexican neighbors. We care about, maybe you use names, if I'm talking to a family member, maybe I talk about a person that we have a common point of reference. If I'm talking to someone who goes to my school, maybe I talk about a family they know, real people. And then we can drill into, okay, well, you're saying that you don't want to behave in this way, or that you're not this way. Here, let me show you some ways that I feel like you might be contributing to systemic racism or xenophobic laws, all that kind of stuff. But it's pointing people back to what they state their values. And then it's kind of asking people, okay, well, if this is your stated value, are you living to that, and pushing in where it may not look like that's true? Because I think that there are a lot of people who think family values, that's another great one too. Okay, well, you say that you have family values, or you're pro-life. Well, let's dive into that. And where do some of these policies that you agree with maybe not look super family valued when we're sending, when we're fracturing families due to immigration laws, or we're, deporting people that have children who are still living here, or when we're putting laws into place that don't actually honor life. So I think, again, it's getting into values, and then drilling into how policies do or don't match stated values.
Awesome. That's really good. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move into the last question for each of you in 2 minutes or less. We're talking about this. This is some heavy stuff. I appreciate that we're all in this struggle together. I don't hear anyone saying, hey, this is the way to do it, but here's some unhelpful ways to do it. Here's some helpful ways to do it. Now let's practice and experiment together. But what's the opportunity? What's the opportunity if we actually begin to lean into these hard conversations with tools to transform, and with the hope of restoration? And each of you specifically on the topic that you're speaking to today would be excellent. Kristen, because you just talked, let's go back to Aaron. What do you got for us? What's the opportunity to lean into hard conversations around theology?
Around theology, I think it really is, if we go back to that, getting curious. And it goes back to what Jonathan said about the destabilizing discomfort and what can happen in that situation. The whole time we've been talking, one of the things I've been thinking about is how often Jesus talked for those who have ears to hear. And I personally don't think it's super valuable to try to convince people who don't have ears to hear that they should hear. But I think that life brings us to the point unfortunately, with enough pain where we get soft enough to listen. And so there's something about staying close, staying in relationship, and not beating them over and over and over to try to change their opinions, but staying close enough to keep sharing our story. And so when there are ears to hear in that issue, we have that relationship and we have that opportunity.
Thanks, my friend. Awesome. Jonathan, what's the opportunity to lean into hard conversations on race?
To me, the opportunity is for what Dr. King called the beloved community. And to me, this opportunity of actually being able to celebrate and understand someone in a way that you may have never been able to before is a gift in and of itself. So if we can lean into these difficult conversations, what we can actually have is mutually beneficial growth that happens both ways. Like, people of color are able to lead the dominant culture down paths that they never would have been able to go. I mean, one way I always talk about this is imagine if dominant culture people, when they went through difficult experiences, whether that be losing a family member or losing a job or something difficult that happens, have a relationship with a person of color whose entire life has been about how to persevere through the difficult things in life. Like, that is what it means to be Black in America, if you ask me, is how to sustain through oppression and still come out with a smile on the other end. Imagine now having that mutually beneficial relationship that can walk with you and give you tools on how to sustain yourself when things aren't as comfortable or aren't the way you always thought them to be because you've been part of the dominant culture. There are great opportunities for mutual growth and mutually beneficial relationships. And so I hope that people will lean in, because life will be better if we stay at the table.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Kristen, close us out.
Well, I think hopefully the outcome of having hard political conversations is policy change. And I know that can feel really overwhelming, that like a dinner time conversation or having coffee with friends talking politics is going to change the world. And, that one conversation maybe won't. But if we all kind of work our field, if we all kind of commit to talking to the people in our own community, there really can be change. And that change can affect other people, and it can institute more social justice, and it can look like protection from police violence, and it can look like immigration reform that protects people who are living here, and it can look like gun control, and it can look like more rights for LGBT people. So I think when we push in, the real opportunity here in terms of the political arena is that we can help in our democracy actually change the laws that are being instituted.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you to all three of you. This is the collective. I speak for everyone that's been tuning in and been so incredibly gifted by what you've each brought to the table. And for those of you also listening in, lots of questions about what's next and how do I connect with the local community that's practicing this. We want to accompany you in that. And these three are great resources to start that journey. They each have projects underway right now that continue to create space for you to learn from them. And Kristen has a podcast called Why Partisan. We'd highly recommend checking out. We're going to have a link to that and all of these projects in this follow-up email, which I keep mentioning, so keep an eye out for it. Jonathan has a book coming out in the fall called Church Forsaken, Practicing Presence in Neglected Neighborhoods. And Aaron has a book coming out in August called The Eternal Current, How a Practice-Based Faith Can Save Us from Drowning. So please support their work and learn from them by engaging in these projects that are already underway. Again, we'll have links and resources to that. In regards to what Global Immersion can do, as a peacemaking training organization, our work is to actually cultivate and mobilize this movement of everyday peacemakers who are not only having these kinds of conversations, but are practicing this particular way of life. We actually think this is a lived expression of our faith. It's the very best reflection of our faith when we move towards difference and disagreement with tools to heal and to transform. And when it's played out locally, that's when it actually looks like something. And so that is the end goal in this. One tangible next step is to text the word peace as you would imagine spelling it, to the number 66866. We'll drop that in the comment section. Text the word peace to 66866. That's going to give you, you'll get an email right away with a 1-month practice guide for how to live out these everyday peacemaking practices in community. So we actually have tangible practices 7 days a week for 4 weeks for you to experiment with your local community that moves this from an idea to a practiced way of life. It'll also on-ramp you into a series of resources that'll come into your inbox over the next few months. We collectively on this panel have actually assembled a 10 practice guide for having hard conversations. It's a PDF form. It's totally free. We did that intentionally to make this as shareable as possible. So get a hold of that and feel free to pass it along through social media, email, whatever. Kristen warned us against forwarded email. We would say this is the one forwarded email you should take seriously and actually use. 10 practice PDF guide. There'll be a link to that as well if you haven't already downloaded it. And lastly, we have another webinar coming up next month. It's going to specifically highlight the embassy move of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, which is a very significant and very hard conversation. Along with this theme, the reality of Christians and Jews and Muslims in the Holy Land has huge implications for our global family. We're going to have that hard conversation and learn from people on the ground, Israelis, Palestinians, Christian, Jews, Muslims, to hear a perspective and real-time account of what's going on there. We just had a delegation come back from learning from those folks a couple days ago. And so it'll help grow our own awareness and our own practice among those diverse communities here in our neighborhoods in the United States. Thank you all for being part of this. Blessings on your journey. We trust that this is an equipping context, not only for you to get smarter in how to have hard conversations, but for you to go out and practice it. In any way that we can support in that, we are committed to it. Blessings on the journey. Thank you.